supervising agent. Jack, reports of late night activity on the part of pretty much everyone in that family in the house where, Elisa lived, and bizarre behavior that kids out till very, very late at night, cars dashing in and out, temper tantrums exhibited for neighbors to see and hear. What did you make of some of these anecdotal, little dribs and drabs we're getting?
Yeah, unfortunately, Neil, it comes down to the same thing all the time. You find unusual behavior, but yet is it criminal behavior? And that's the problem that law enforcement continually faces in these investigations. As one of your reporters just mentioned, they've already poured thousands of hours into this investigations, and all the numerous agencies, whether it's the FBI, the Boulder Police, and all the surrounding agencies that are working on this, what they're looking at is not totally unusual, and unfortunately didn't rise to the level of any kind of crimes prior to this event, which is very hard for police and hard for law enforcement to work something where a crime yet has not been committed.
Right, and that's the thing, and I'm not, blaming authorities for that, but it does seem to be a pattern here, right, where nothing that they're doing would prompt that they're getting arrested or even talked to by police. But in so many cases, and we were just digging beneath the surface a little bit, Jack, even in the case of the Ronald Reagan assassination attempt by John Hinckley, he was popping up in a number of places ahead of the assassination attempt on Reagan, showing up at a Jimmy Carter event some months earlier. In the Parkland shooting, Nicholas Cruz was being cited by other kids and even their families as being a kid to avoid. And in the Columbine situation with Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris, the same sort of, concern about creepy, unusual behavior. I could go on and on, but I guess you get the gist of it. Where and how do we handle reports of activity that frightens people to the point they want to inform police, but they've got nothing on the guy, just concerns about the guy and his family?
Absolutely correct, Neil. And we definitely do not want to discourage anybody from contacting law enforcement. I know when I was at the FBI, we would get thousands of calls a week about people. And to use your term, creepy behavior, unfortunately, there's a lot of people out there with creepy behavior, but yet not enough for law enforcement to do something. We saw a lot of this after 9/11, where we would get calls consistently about suspicious behavior. And we conducted hundreds of thousands of interviews around the country, around the world, with our law enforcement and intelligence partners to try and find out or identify potential problems. And maybe that stopped something, maybe it didn't, and we'll never know. And sometimes it's just an interview or something like that, simple as that can persuade somebody to maybe think twice about doing something. But at the end of the day, until something rises to a crime where law enforcement can actually react, it's a challenging situation at best.
Because there are indications that the weapon he purchased, he did so legally. And so it gets beyond just the weapon, right?
It absolutely does. There's a lot to be said for, I know gun control is obviously one of the biggest, contentious issues in our country right now. And there's two sides to that fence. No guns for anybody. But, then again, in some states that have shown where possessing a weapon is legal, people think twice before pulling a weapon. So you can slice that both sides of the fence when it comes down to gun control. So at the end of the day, is it the gun or is it the person? And unfortunately, that's the world we live in.
Yeah, I think you're right, my friend. Jack, thank you very much. Jack Dubin, a retired FBI supervising agent here. As we close out this hour, I do want to take you back to the border. These live drone shots we are getting from over Donna, Texas. Of course, this is where a lot of the key senators, Republican senators, 19 of them, visited yesterday a facility holding thousands of largely teenagers here who are going to be shipped elsewhere. The read from a senator who was there and why he's worried about that population exploding. All right, the latest on the border surge. It depends on who you talk to, whether it's a crisis or something very, very bad, but maybe it can be both at the same time. The president himself has deferred to take any blame for what's happening there. It says this happens under a lot of administrations. We're going to get to that in just a second. Also talk to a Republican senator who was among the 19 taking a tour along the Rio Grande of these facilities. But in the meantime, Steve Harrigan in Mission, Texas, where things stand right now. Steve.
Neil, we watched those 19 Republican senators in action yesterday. They took a tour on the ground along the border. They were also right here in gunboats on the Rio Grande, and they visited a facility in Donna, which has severe overcrowding. They had a really fiery press conference afterward, which they said there should be a return to the policy of the Trump administration. That's when migrants had to apply for asylum in Mexico, not be allowed to come into the U.S., and a number of senators were sharply critical of the conditions they saw with their own eyes in the Donna holding facility.
The Donna facility is a giant tent city. Built with a capacity of 250, it has nearly 4,000 people in it. We saw cages after cages after cages of little girls, of little boys, lying side by side, touching each other, covered with reflective emergency blankets.
Biden administration officials deny that there's any connection between the Biden policies and the surge in especially unaccompanied minors coming across the border. They say many of the families from Central America are facing life and death situations regardless of who is in the Oval Office. Director of Homeland Security also has fired 32 members of the Homeland Security Advisory Council. These are unpaid advisors. But no matter who you hold responsible for the crisis on the border, one thing that cannot be argued against is the basic numbers. Customs and Border Protection show in the month of February, more than 100,000 attempted illegal crossings of the border. If you compare that to 1 month ago, January, it's up 28%. If you compare it to 1 year ago, the previous February, that's almost a triple increase in the numbers of people attempting to cross the border illegally. Neil, back to you.
Steve Harrigan, thank you very, very much. Well, this is where we are right now. One side calls it a crisis. The other says it's a serious situation and we're watching it. But when it came to his press conference this week, his first of his presidency after 65 days in office, Joe Biden went to great lengths to separate himself from what was happening down there. Take a look.
Did you move too quickly to roll back some of the executive orders of your predecessor?
I make no apology for that.
Is what's happening inside acceptable to you? And when is this going to be fixed?
That's a serious question, right? Is it acceptable to me? Come on. That's why we're going to be moving 1,000 of those kids out quickly.
No president really likes to see and acknowledge a crisis happening in his administration. John Kennedy had to deal with something very similar when it came to the racial riots and the battle to integrate colleges and universities across much of the South. It's a thankless task, but we realize in the right moment and at the right time, blame and accountability isn't the issue as much as responding to the issue itself. Take a look at this, JFK addressing what was a very much ignored problem in this country, but had gotten so fiery, it couldn't be ignored anymore. Take a look.
This is one country. It has become one country because all of us and all the people who came here had an equal chance to develop their talents. We cannot say to 10% of the population that you can't have that right. That your children can't have the chance to develop whatever talents they have. That the only way that they're going to get their rights is to go in the street and demonstrate. I think we owe them and we owe ourselves a better country than that. Therefore, I'm asking for your help in making it easier for us to move ahead and to provide the kind of equality of treatment which we would want ourselves.
I want you to put yourself back in that time, the early 1960s, when this was happening, and a lot of advisors were telling Kennedy just to acknowledge the problem and say we had to do something about it would hurt him in the South politically. He was well aware of those risks, but essentially he deemed it to be the right thing to do. Now, there's no way you can compare what's going on now to what was going on then, save the fact that a president then acknowledged the severity of a problem that no one could miss, and these images that became famous also galvanized a nation. But it started with JFK making sure they were galvanized. Now, politically, you could look back at that and say it hurt Democrats. Their lock on the South was beginning to go away as a result of this approach. That was then. What to make of what's going on right now? Bert Folsom, the presidential historian extraordinaire, best-selling author. I'm not meaning to equate the two, Bert. I am, though, drawing a distinction between responding to a crisis? One acknowledging it, the other, at least now, not. What do you think?
Right. I think that the crises do have some degree of comparability. They're both very severe. And it's interesting, too, although it's not clear whether President Biden is serious on doing something about it, the border crisis. People thought that about Kennedy in 1963 with the civil rights movement, too. And it turns out he was serious. And he was making very good statements about the need to integrate universities, in particular the University of Alabama at that time, and the activities in Birmingham, nearby Birmingham. And so Kennedy was serious. He gave a speech on it. One thing that both Kennedy and Biden have going for them, if Biden is serious on this, is that in both cases, the Republicans, the people in the other party, were completely behind them, or at least largely behind them. Kennedy, ultimately on the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, which President Johnson was able to get passed for Kennedy, we had about 80% of the Republicans favored it. A much stronger contingent of Democrats opposed it. In fact, we had a filibuster by 18 Democrats in the Senate against it. And so I guess what I'm saying is that Kennedy could go into the civil rights crisis and advocate civil rights action with the confidence that the Republicans would back him on this. The same is true with President Biden. President Trump was building parts of the wall ever since President Reagan's administration, when amnesty was given, and there was a promise that we would fix the border crisis. The Democrats never really have come to the table on that to help fix it, and they opposed President Trump building the wall. The Republicans would be in favor of national security, strong borders. If Biden is serious about fixing this problem, he will have Republican support for doing so.
You know, I also wonder, Bert, about the power of images. Obviously, the president, even Martin Luther King at the time, criticized JFK for being late to respond to these attacks on, blacks and the integration efforts that were stymied in much of the South. But it was a tough juggle. He had to slowly build support among what was a largely white population, and that was an uphill battle. But those images where blacks were attacked by dogs and shot at and buses blown up, they galvanized a nation and jarred them to sort of help Kennedy make his case. Now, we are not seeing a lot of these images inside these detention centers and migration minor holding facilities. But I suspect if we did and we saw them more regularly, there would be a collective outrage here, and not a blame on anyone in power as much as you've got to fix this. I think Kennedy got the sense of this is a humanitarian issue that has gone way out of control, and he had images to support his case. And he, won a nation over. And to your point, we got civil rights and some of these things done, sadly, after his assassination. But I'm wondering, without those images, without seeing the proof of this, Fox has shown them and all, but other networks were showing them as well when we were seeing these same detention centers during President Trump. I argue for fairness for all. Offensive detention center housing issues should be fair game, whether it's a Democratic, Republican, president and or Congress. But what do you make of that portion of this?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. The televised attacks on civil rights marchers in Birmingham in 1963 were powerful on television, and they created a backlash nationally against the segregationists. That may have given Kennedy, as you suggest, Neil, the nudge to go ahead and make his national address and put his administration, along with the Republicans, on the side of civil rights, and thus, with Johnson's help later, guaranteeing the passage of that civil rights bill. Remember, though, the Democrats, he's changing the party's direction. The Democrats had been strongly against civil rights. They had led the filibusters in the Senate, opposing civil rights. They had they opposed anti-lynching bills, the Democrats did, and 0 Democrats in Congress voted for the 15th Amendment. back in 1870 to give blacks the vote, so that he was undoing 90 years of damage that the Democratic Party had done to black Americans and joining in a movement that would create civil rights for blacks and for all Americans. And that was powerful when it was done then with the television attacks on the civil rights marchers. I think you're absolutely on target on that.
Well, I just thought we should explore it, Bert. You're the expert here. I did find the differences to be startling here, but I generally think most Americans really don't care who gets the credit or the blame, just that it probably be fixed. And a president, a leader of a country, no matter his time, no matter his party, who acknowledges the obvious is getting much closer to dealing with the obvious.
Right. If
but
President
Bert,
Biden will take... Sure. Thank you, Neil.
No, I appreciate it. Bert, thank you. Go ahead, please. My bad. Okay, we did. I really interrupted him to the point that he couldn't be interrupted anymore. I apologize for that. Bert Folsom on all that. We're only putting this up there not to make one president look good, one president look bad. We tried to compare and bring a Democrat there to say this crisis, if you don't want to call it crisis, but the situation is serious enough now to put all that aside, the blame game, the credit game, any of that, and just look at maybe solving it and acknowledging the elephant in the room, getting bigger, getting nastier, getting more worrisome by the minute. All right, we have a lot more coming up because I do want to impart some news that is a little startling here. China and Iran in a multi-billion-dollar, up to 25-year cooperation. All right, what could possibly go wrong here for us, for the United States? China and Iran signing a 25-year agreement that calls for China to purchase billions of dollars worth of goods, including so far frozen oil supplies from the Iranians to keep them afloat, if you will, and to tighten that relationship. But it occurs at the same time, just days earlier, Russia and China started cozying up and called for more cooperation in a host of areas. Anyway, Lieutenant Colonel Bob McGinnis following it very closely. The author of Give Me Liberty, Not Marxism, much more. Colonel, they say things come in waves, and these are waves of concern, I would imagine, for you. What do you think of this?
Well, they really are, Neil. Last week, of course, we met with the Chinese in Alaska and got our lunch handed to us to a certain degree. And then here we find that Wang Yi, the foreign minister, was in Tehran signing this 25-year agreement. And of course, this month they've been importing, the Chinese importing Iranian oil in spite of our objections. What this is going to do for the Iranian regime is to bolster it, radically increase exports as well as imports. And of course, they've been cooperating with the Iranians and the Russians for a couple of years on military exercises. What's not said here, and we need to pay attention to, Neil, is that Wang Yi is also going to Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Bahrain, Oman, UAE, and so forth over the next week. And he's going there to do commercial as well as strategic bidding. And of course, this is all part of not only what President Xi has in mind to become the world's hegemon, but of course they're using Belt and Road Initiative, which gives them leverage in every country like Iran where they make major investments.
Joe Biden apparently welcomes a summit with Xi Jinping of China and Vladimir Putin of Russia. How likely do you think that will be?
Well, I was not encouraged by the president's acumen the other day on his press conference. When you're dealing with President Xi or Vladimir Putin, they're very sharp. They're very capable. They do their homework. I'm not sure that Mr. Biden has demonstrated that sort of skill at the international level on all these very complex issues. He won't be able to use notes in those situations. He'll have to, face them face to face. Now, I know President Biden has in the past met extensively with President Xi, and in fact, he had a couple-hour phone call with President Xi at the early part of his administration.
There's a page one story in today's Financial Times, of all places, Colonel, in which there are reports that the U.S. fears that China, quoting here, is flirting with seizing control of Taiwan. Now, though it might seem outlandish, that they feel that there'd be no repercussions if they made such a move. What did you think of that?
Well, as you know, we've seen just yesterday a entourage of 20 combatant aircraft from the Chinese Communist regime pass very close to Taiwan. Now, this is a fairly frequent occurrence, but when you include 4 nuclear-capable bombers, that's significant. Now, meanwhile, we are seeing them just in our face with regard to Hong Kong, with regard to Senkaku Islands that are claimed by Japan. They are allowing their own Coast Guard to open fire in situations in the South China Sea, which is a change in law. So they're becoming far more aggressive than we saw during the last several years. And I fear that not only what Wang Yi is doing in the Middle East and what they did to us in Alaska, they're going to continue and just up the ante as we come into the next couple of years.
I should posit as well, Colonel, the same article goes into the naysayers who don't think that China would even contemplate something like that because economically, strained though our trade relations may be, we still need each other, and that the argument was made the Chinese don't want to screw that up, that would be the one motivator not to do this sort of thing. What did you think of that?
Yeah, well, I understand the economics are very, very critical. Obviously, the foreign minister in the Middle East, and they're feeling somewhat of the pinch on the sanctions that we have on them as well. But at the same time, I will tell you, we're trying to cover all bases. Just this past week, we were talking to the Japanese about protecting our surface ships and our aircraft should the Chinese invade Taiwan. It's not out of the question. The provocations are very real. Yes, there are some trade-offs, but President Xi has made it very clear to his people, and so have the military on the side, that they have every intention of making Taiwan part of mainland China as soon as possible, perhaps in the next few years.
Bob McGinnis, thank you, my friend, coming in.